He was like many men, ambitious, restless, hungry for change. He wanted to be rich, not for greed's sake, but because he saw what money could mean: freedom from worry, the ability to provide without strain, the power to say yes to opportunity instead of watching it pass. So he tried everything. He sold products door to door, hoping that charm and persistence would break through. He jumped into new businesses that promised fast returns. He attended seminars, bought every new book on the subject of wealth, memorized slogans and success formulas, and yet each time the results were fleeting. His bank account would swell for a moment, only to drain again. It was as though he were running on a treadmill, working hard but staying in place. And in those quiet hours late at night when the noise faded and the truth could be heard, he knew something was missing. Not effort. He had that in abundance. Not desire. His was stronger than most. What he lacked was understanding. He didn't realize that wealth is not built on frantic motion, but on deliberate design. He thought opportunity was something you chased, when in reality it's something you attract by becoming the right kind of person. That was the turning point when he began to understand that money flows to value and value begins in the mind. He saw that all his past attempts were aimed outward toward the marketplace, without first aiming inward toward the source of every result, his own thinking. He remembered the line he'd heard but never understood. We become what we think about. At first it sounded too simple, too abstract to be the missing key. But the more he studied it, the more he saw it wasn't just a clever phrase, it was a law. If your dominant thoughts are focused on lack, fear, or scattered effort, your results will reflect it. If your mind is concentrated on a clear goal, fueled by discipline and sustained by faith in its achievement, the outside world eventually bends to match. So he began the real work, not the kind that starts with a business card, but the kind that starts with a notepad. He wrote down exactly what he wanted in as much detail as he could summon. No more vague goals like, "I want to be rich." Instead, he defined the amount, the timeline, and what he was willing to give in exchange, because he finally understood that the marketplace does not pay for wishing, it pays for service, for skill, for solutions. He asked himself, what problem can I solve so well that people would gladly pay me for it? That single question began to clear the fog. He saw that wealth is never a pursuit of money itself. It is the pursuit of becoming valuable enough that money becomes the natural byproduct. In the beginning, this shift was uncomfortable. It forced him to confront the truth that he had been chasing shortcuts. He had been chasing the effect instead of the cause. That's why the wins never lasted. He was building results on sand instead of stone. Now he began to study his craft, to invest in knowledge that had direct application to the value he could create. He became a student again, not of theory, but of practice. And as he did, he noticed something subtle but powerful. The more he grew his value, the less desperate he felt. The more he developed skill, the more confident he became. He stopped chasing deals and started attracting them. Opportunities began to show up unannounced, not because the world had suddenly become generous, but because his preparation had finally met the moment. One of the first lessons he learned in this transformation was that money is a mirror. It reflects who you are, not who you wish to be. If you are careless, it will reveal it. If you are disciplined, it will reward it. If you are scattered, it will slip through your fingers. This meant that before he could hold more money, he had to become the kind of man who could manage it. So he learned the principles of stewardship. He studied how to keep more of what he earned, how to allocate it toward growth instead of consumption, how to make every dollar work for him instead of against him. And slowly, the old cycle began to break. His savings grew, his investments took root. For the first time in years, he felt not just the thrill of making money, but the stability of keeping it. Another breakthrough came when he recognized the power of association. In the past, he had surrounded himself with people who were always chasing the next big thing, who valued speed over substance. Their excitement was contagious, but so was their instability. Now he sought out those who thought in decades instead of days, who built with patience and strategy, who measured wealth not just in dollars, but in freedom and impact. Their conversations were different. They talked about systems, about creating assets, about solving problems at scale. And in their company, his thinking expanded. He began to see wealth not as a quick escape, but as the steady accumulation of value over time. Perhaps the most profound change of all was in his attitude. Before, he had seen work as a means to an end, something to get through so he could enjoy the rewards. Now he saw the work itself as the reward, the daily discipline, the growth, the mastery. The joy was not in the arrival, but in the becoming. And in that shift, he discovered a kind of peace he had never known. He no longer needed wealth to validate him. He was building it because it was the natural outcome of living in alignment with his highest abilities. And ironically, the less he clung to money, the more it seemed to flow to him. By the time he looked back on his old life, he saw clearly why all those earlier efforts had failed. He had been trying to force success without becoming the kind of man success belongs to. Now everything was different, not because the economy had changed, not because luck had found him, but because he had changed. The habits were different. The thinking was different. The company he kept was different. And so inevitably, the results were different. That is what actually works. Not the frantic search for the perfect opportunity, but the deliberate shaping of the mind and character until you can recognize opportunity when it comes and then seize it with both hands. When he truly grasped that wealth was the result of value creation and not the product of luck or chance, his entire outlook shifted. The man who once chased opportunity in a scattershot fashion now understood the need for a central focus, a guiding star. He stopped dabbling in every promising venture and instead chose a single area in which he could become excellent. This was not an easy choice. Walking away from certain projects felt like admitting defeat, but he began to see the truth, that spreading himself too thin was the very reason nothing had grown deep roots. Just as a farmer doesn't plant a little here and a little there and expect a great harvest, he could no longer divide his energy among half-formed ideas. Wealth, he realized, requires concentrated effort over time, directed towards something worthy. Once he made that commitment, he felt a new clarity. For the first time, his actions had a rhythm, a continuity, a compounding effect. He began to design his days with purpose. Before, he would fill his calendar reactively, chasing whatever seemed urgent. Now his schedule revolved around high-value activities that moved the needle. He knew the difference between being busy and being productive, and he chose the latter. There were fewer tasks, but they mattered more. He gave his mornings to the hardest, most impactful work, the kind that demanded his best thinking and yielded the greatest return. This single habit began to separate him from the man he used to be. The discipline of showing up for his priorities, even when no one was watching, built a kind of confidence that no short-term win could give him. It was the confidence that comes from living in alignment with a goal you have chosen deliberately, and that you have the patience to see through to the end. Another key shift came when he stopped underestimating the compounding power of small improvements. Before, he was looking for breakthroughs, big wins that would change everything overnight. But breakthroughs, he learned, are rarely lightning strikes. They are the result of steady, incremental gains stacking up over time. He started asking himself, how can I improve this by just 1% today? 1% in skill, 1% in efficiency, 1% in service to others. These improvements felt insignificant in the moment, but over months and years they began to transform his results entirely. Like interest accruing quietly in an account, the gains were invisible at first, but then they began to appear everywhere, in his income, in his reputation, in his opportunities. He also confronted the uncomfortable truth that his old way of thinking about money was backward. He used to believe you make money, then decide what to do with it. Now he understood you must first decide the purpose for your money, then earn it in ways aligned with that purpose. This changed his spending habits overnight. He no longer sought to impress with appearances, no longer measured his progress by what he could buy. Every dollar had a job, and most of those jobs involved building assets, reducing liabilities, and funding opportunities that could grow. This level of intentionality gave him something rare, a sense of control. Money was no longer a source of stress, it was a tool under his direction. The man also learned to respect the seasons of wealth building. In the past, if results didn't appear quickly, he would abandon the effort. Now he understood that like planting a seed, there is a time to sow, a time to tend, and a time to harvest, and that trying to skip steps is the surest way to ruin the crop. In his new mindset, slow months were not failures, they were part of the cycle. He used them to learn, to refine, to prepare for the inevitable upswing that comes when you've been planting and watering faithfully. Patience became not a passive waiting, but an active investment in the process. He began surrounding himself with people who thought the same way. These were not merely high earners, but high builders. Men and women who understood principles, not just tactics. In their company, talk of get-rich-quick schemes vanished, replaced by discussions about systems, service, and scale. They asked better questions, and those questions expanded his thinking. Instead of how can I make more this month, he began asking, how can I create something that will continue to pay me a decade from now? That single shift took him out of the mindset of hustling for scraps and into the mindset of constructing wealth that could endure. A critical realization during this period was that wealth and personal growth are inseparable. You cannot out-earn your self-image for long. If you see yourself as someone who earns a little, you will find ways to shrink big wins down to match that belief. He began to work on his mind as much as his business. He studied philosophy, leadership, negotiation, anything that would make him more effective in the way he thought and acted. He wrote affirmations and reviewed them daily, not as magic spells but as reminders to stay aligned with his vision. Slowly, his self-concept began to rise, and as it did, so did his results. By now, the man who once scattered his effort was unrecognizable. His days had structure, his work had meaning, his money had direction, his circle had influence, and his mind had clarity. The chaos of his earlier attempts had been replaced by a calm determination. He was no longer just trying to get rich, he was becoming rich in every sense of the word, and as he looked at the path ahead, he no longer wondered if it would work. He knew it would, because the process itself had already changed him into the kind of man for whom wealth is not an accident, but an inevitability. He began to see that one of his greatest mistakes in the early years was treating wealth like a sprint rather than a marathon. Every time he stumbled across a new opportunity, he would rush headlong into it, pushing as hard as possible in the first burst of excitement. But excitement has a short lifespan, and once it faded, so did his consistency. The result was always the same: half-finished projects, depleted energy, and nothing lasting to show for it. Now he understood that the real builders of wealth pace themselves. They conserve energy for the long haul. They plan with years in mind, not weeks. They accept that anything worth creating takes time, and they measure progress not just by what is gained in the moment, but by what can be sustained over decades. This shift from sprinting to steady, deliberate movement gave him a sense of control he had never felt before. He was no longer chasing, he was building. He also realized that his earlier failures had been fueled by a misunderstanding of leverage. Back then, he thought leverage meant finding a way to do less work for more gain, and while there is truth to efficiency, he had mistaken laziness for smart strategy. True leverage, he learned, comes from amplifying your efforts through systems, people, and tools, multipliers that allow the same hour of your time to produce many times the result. Instead of looking for ways to escape the work, he looked for ways to expand the impact of the work he was already doing. He learned to delegate, to automate, and to create processes that would keep producing value long after the initial effort was made. It was in this understanding that his earning potential stopped being limited by the number of hours he could work in a day. Another breakthrough came when he began to study the role of mindset in sustaining momentum. In the past, he thought skill alone was enough, that if he learned the right tactics, results would follow automatically. But skill without the right mindset is like a powerful engine with no fuel. When challenges came, his old way of thinking would magnify the obstacles until they looked insurmountable. This time he trained himself to see problems as puzzles, not as walls. Each difficulty became an opportunity to gain an advantage others would miss because they gave up too soon. By adopting the mindset of a problem solver, he not only kept moving forward, but he also began to notice opportunities embedded within the very challenges that once discouraged him. He recognized, too, that his relationship with failure had to change. Before failure was final, it was proof that he had chosen the wrong path. Now it was part of the process. In fact, he began to expect it. Not in the sense of seeking defeat, but in understanding that every worthwhile venture would have points of resistance, and that those moments were where the best lessons were hidden. Instead of withdrawing when he failed, he documented what happened, analyzed it, and used it to adjust course. He realized that in every failure there were clues about timing, about strategy, about execution, that could make the next attempt far stronger. This willingness to study failure rather than fear it became one of his greatest assets. One of the more subtle but powerful changes he made was learning to filter opportunities through a single question: does this align with my long-term vision? Before, he would take on almost anything that promised a return, and his energy was constantly pulled in different directions. Now, if an opportunity did not fit the larger plan, it was an automatic no. This was not easy at first. Turning down quick money felt counterintuitive, but over time it became clear that each no to something misaligned was a yes to something important. This clarity of focus meant that everything he worked on built toward the same outcome, and that compounded his results in a way scattered effort never could. He also began to take mastery of his environment seriously. He understood that surroundings shape behavior, and behavior shapes results, so he redesigned his workspace to reflect the discipline and focus he wanted in his mind. He eliminated the distractions, organized his tools, and created an atmosphere where concentration came naturally. This extended beyond the physical environment to the people he allowed into his inner circle. He sought out those whose values matched his own, who pushed him to aim higher, and who themselves were committed to growth. The effect was immediate: less wasted time, more meaningful conversation, and a constant reminder of the standards he had set for himself. Perhaps the most transformative realization was that wealth was not just about accumulation, it was about contribution. In his earlier pursuits, the goal had been to get. Now the goal was to give more value than anyone else in his space. He discovered that when he focused on helping others solve meaningful problems, the rewards returned to him many times over. Customers became loyal, relationships deepened, his reputation grew, and with it his opportunities multiplied. This principle, serve first, receive second, became a cornerstone of everything he did. By the end of this stage in his journey, he no longer doubted the path. The frantic trial and error of his past had been replaced by a calm, steady progression. He was pacing himself for longevity, leveraging his efforts intelligently, filtering his choices with clarity, and seeing every challenge as a step forward rather than a setback. He wasn't just trying everything anymore, he was doing what actually works, and doing it with the kind of focus that makes success not just possible, but inevitable. One of the most important truths he learned at this stage was that money is not the goal, it is the measure of how well you are serving others. In his earlier years, he had treated the pursuit of wealth as though it were a standalone mission, separate from the work itself. That was why the work always felt exhausting and the rewards inconsistent. Now he understood that income follows impact, and impact follows value delivered. If you want more money, you must give more value, consistently, deliberately, and at a level that others cannot easily match. This single shift in thinking changed the way he approached everything. Every meeting, every product, every service became an opportunity to exceed expectations. And each time he did, the marketplace responded, not instantly but predictably. Over time, his name became associated with reliability, quality, and results, and those three qualities are magnets for opportunity. He also came to see the danger of drifting into complacency once a little success arrived. In the past, he had celebrated early wins too much, relaxing his discipline the moment progress became visible. The result was always the same. The momentum faded, the growth stalled, and the opportunities that could have compounded slipped away. This time, he guarded against that tendency. Small wins were acknowledged but never over-celebrated. They were steps along the path, not the destination. He learned to keep his eyes forward, always asking, what's the next level? How can I raise the standard? This mindset kept him from coasting when things were going well and prevented the slow decay that complacency always brings. Another shift in his development was the decision to build assets instead of only chasing income. Before, he had been entirely focused on what he could earn today. Now he dedicated a portion of his time, effort, and money to creating things that would continue to produce value in the future, investments, systems, intellectual property, and relationships that would outlast any single transaction. He realized that true wealth builders think in layers. They have income that supports their present and assets that secure their future. This was a major reason so many people who earned big money still ended up broke. They had no assets, only earnings. By building both, he was protecting himself from the volatility of the market and the unpredictability of life. He also began to understand the multiplier effect of reputation. Early in his career, he had underestimated how much faster doors open when your name carries trust. He had assumed that results alone were enough. Now he knew that results matter, but your reputation precedes them. People do business with those they believe in before they see the proof, and that belief is built over time through consistent character and integrity. He became intentional about protecting his reputation, not by being perfect, but by being honest, dependable, and consistent. If a mistake was made, he owned it. If a promise was given, it was kept. And with each year that passed, his name began to carry a kind of quiet power in his industry. Another lesson was the necessity of mastering personal energy. Wealth building demands clarity of thought, stamina of body, and steadiness of emotion. In his earlier pursuits, he had treated his energy as an afterthought, pushing through fatigue and neglecting his health in the name of productivity. But he came to realize that a drained body makes a clouded mind, and a clouded mind makes poor decisions. Now he treated his health as a business asset. Proper rest, smart nutrition, and regular exercise were no longer optional. They were as essential as reviewing his finances or meeting with clients. And the return on this investment was clear: better focus, stronger execution, and a resilience that kept him going when others quit. He also started to think in terms of leverage beyond his own effort. In the past, he had prided himself on doing everything himself, believing that hard work alone was the mark of dedication. But hard work without leverage is limited work. He began to seek out partnerships, collaborations, and systems that could extend his reach far beyond what he could do alone. Delegating became a skill, and choosing the right people to trust with parts of his vision became a priority. This didn't just free his time, it multiplied his output. allowing him to operate on a scale that was impossible before. Finally, he understood that what works is rarely what is flashy. The principles that build lasting wealth are almost always simple: focus, discipline, consistency, service, and reinvestment. But because they are simple, most people overlook them, thinking the answer must be more complex. He stopped looking for novelty and started mastering the fundamentals, refining them until they became second nature. And it was in this quiet mastery, not in dramatic leaps, that his financial life began to transform permanently. By now, he no longer doubted whether he would succeed. The proof was in the pattern, and the pattern was sound. Every day he was building not just wealth, but the kind of character, skill, and structure that could hold it. He had stopped chasing every opportunity and started creating the right ones. He had stopped treating wealth as an event and started treating it as a process. And because of that, he was no longer at the mercy of luck. He was in control of his own momentum. One of the greatest realizations he came to at this stage was that wealth is not built in isolation, it is built in the context of relationships. In his earlier years, he had focused so much on individual effort that he neglected the immense value of networks, alliances, and partnerships. He thought success was a solo climb, but now he understood that the right connections could shorten the journey, open hidden doors, and multiply results far beyond what one person could achieve alone. He began to invest in relationships not as transactions, but as long-term bonds built on trust, respect, and mutual benefit. He gave before he asked, contributed before he expected, and over time these relationships became one of his most valuable assets. Many of his greatest opportunities from this point forward did not come from cold searches. They came from the warm introductions and recommendations of people who believed in him because he had proven himself valuable to them first. He also realized the importance of reputation in every transaction. Not just in business deals, but in casual conversations, social interactions, and even the smallest commitments. The way you conduct yourself when no one is watching eventually becomes known. He began to carry himself with the awareness that every interaction was either building or eroding the trust others placed in his name. He understood that trust could not be bought, it could only be earned, and it could be lost far faster than it was gained. This awareness made him more intentional with his words, more careful with his promises, and more consistent in his follow-through. And as his reliability grew, so did his influence. People began to seek him out not only for what he could do, but because they knew he could be counted on to do it well. Another shift came in his understanding of the balance between offense and defense in wealth building. Before, he had been all offense, constantly seeking ways to make more money, while neglecting the defense of protecting and preserving what he had earned. Now he saw that making money without protecting it is like pouring water into a bucket full of holes. He learned about asset protection, insurance, diversification, and legal structures that could shield his wealth from unnecessary risk. He also became more disciplined in resisting the temptation to overextend himself in pursuit of aggressive gains. This balance gave him a new kind of stability, one where growth could continue without the constant threat of collapse from a single misstep. He became equally serious about the stewardship of his time. Time, he realized, was the one resource he could never replenish, and how he used it was a reflection of how seriously he took his goals. He began auditing his days the way an investor audits a portfolio, looking for wasted hours, low-return activities, and distractions that had no place in his mission. Every commitment was measured against his highest priorities. If it didn't serve his vision, it didn't make it into his schedule. This discipline was not about being rigid, it was about being intentional. And the effect was profound. By reclaiming hours that were once lost to trivial tasks, he found himself with more energy, more clarity, and more capacity to focus on the work that truly moved him forward. A critical factor in his transformation was learning to manage his emotional state with the same discipline he applied to his finances. Before, he had allowed fear, frustration, or overconfidence to influence his decisions. These emotional swings often led to impulsive choices, whether in investments, partnerships, or strategy. Now he approached major decisions with a calm, measured mindset. He learned to pause before reacting, to gather information before committing, and to assess risks without being blinded by emotion. This emotional steadiness became a competitive advantage in high-pressure situations where others panicked or rushed. While others were making costly mistakes under stress, he was making clear, rational moves that positioned him for long-term success. He also embraced the principle of continual reinvestment, not just of money, but of knowledge, skill, and experience. Every profit, whether financial or intellectual, became fuel for further growth. Instead of extracting value from his business and ventures too soon, he put much of it back into improving systems, hiring better talent, upgrading tools, and expanding reach. Personally, he reinvested in his own education, attending advanced training, studying new industries, and learning from those ahead of him. He knew that the moment you stop growing, you begin declining. Reinvestment ensured that both he and his ventures stayed sharp, competitive, and relevant. Perhaps most importantly, he developed the ability to think generationally. Early in his journey, his goals had been entirely personal, focused on his own comfort and security. Now he began to plan for wealth that would outlast him, wealth that could provide opportunity for his family, contribute to causes he cared about, and continue to grow long after he was gone. This long-term perspective changed the way he made every decision. Short-term wins that didn't serve the bigger picture lost their appeal. He began to think like a custodian of something greater than himself, and that sense of stewardship gave his work a deeper meaning. By the time he reached this level, he could see clearly why so many fail to hold on to wealth even after they find it. They neglect the unseen foundations: character, discipline, stewardship, relationships, and long-term vision that keep it secure. But he had built those foundations brick by brick, and he continued to strengthen them daily. Wealth was no longer a fleeting goal or a fragile possession. It was a reflection of the person he had become, and that person was now capable of building, keeping, and growing it for the rest of his life. At this stage of his journey, he began to understand that the most dangerous threat to sustained wealth is not the market, competition, or even external crisis. It is self-sabotage. Success brings with it a set of temptations that are invisible to those still struggling. The temptation to become lax with discipline, to believe you are invincible to setbacks, to start thinking the rules no longer apply to you. He had seen others fall to this trap. Men and women who had built fortunes only to lose them in reckless ventures, inflated lifestyles, or a gradual erosion of standards. Determined not to repeat their mistakes, he made it a personal rule that success would never be a signal to relax, but a reason to double down on the very habits that got him there. The systems, routines, and decision-making frameworks he had built during the climb became even more important in the maintaining phase. He also learned the value of invisibility. Earlier in his career, he had assumed that wealth should be displayed, that visible success was a signal of credibility and achievement. But he came to see that the loudest wealth is often the weakest, and the strongest wealth often operates quietly, without fanfare. Public recognition can attract opportunities, but it can also attract envy, false friendships, and unwanted scrutiny. He chose instead to let results speak for themselves and to keep his personal life guarded. This allowed him to focus on building without the noise of public expectation and without the pressure to maintain an image that might distract from his mission. Another principle he embraced was the need to remain a student. Complacency often comes disguised as mastery, the belief that because you have succeeded, you have nothing left to learn. He rejected that entirely. In his mind, mastery was not a destination but a moving target, one that required constant adjustment, refinement, and humility. He kept learning, not just in his core field, but in related disciplines that could broaden his perspective. He sought mentors who had walked even further down the path, and he asked questions without ego. By maintaining a learner's mindset, he kept his edge sharp and his strategies fresh, ensuring that he could adapt to change before it was forced upon him. He became increasingly focused on creating systems that could outlast his personal involvement. True wealth, he realized, was not just about what you could earn, but about what you could sustain without your constant presence. If the entire operation relied on him showing up every day, then all he had built was a high-paying job. He invested time in building leadership teams, training others to uphold the vision, and documenting processes so that success could continue even if he stepped away. This was more than succession planning. It was about creating something that could endure and grow, a legacy that was resilient to time and circumstance. Another shift was in the way he measured progress. Early on, numbers alone, revenue, profit, assets were his main indicators. Now he also measured the quality of his time, the health of his relationships, and the impact of his work on others. He understood that financial metrics were only part of the scorecard. The ultimate measure of wealth was the freedom to live deliberately, to choose how to spend each day without being bound by necessity or fear. This holistic view of success kept him from making decisions that might boost short-term profit at the expense of long-term fulfillment. He also placed greater emphasis on risk management. Risk could no longer be viewed solely as something to avoid. It was a force to be understood and harnessed. Calculated risks had brought him this far, but now he learned to layer protection into every venture. This meant diversifying income streams, maintaining strong reserves, and ensuring that no single point of failure could threaten the entire structure. He thought of it like building a fortress, walls strong enough to withstand storms, but with enough flexibility to adapt when the terrain shifted. This mindset allowed him to take bold moves without gambling recklessly, giving him both security and agility. Perhaps one of the most important lessons at this stage was that the principles that build wealth are the same principles that keep it: discipline, clarity, consistency, and service. He saw that while tactics could change with the times, principles were timeless. And so he revisited them regularly, refining and reinforcing them. He knew that habits could drift if left unchecked, and drift is the quiet undoing of great fortunes. By staying anchored to the fundamentals, he ensured that growth remained stable and decline never caught him by surprise. By now, wealth was no longer a finish line he was racing toward. It was the natural byproduct of living in alignment with proven principles. He had built it deliberately, he was keeping it intelligently, and he was preparing it to last beyond his lifetime. And in that, he had discovered something unexpected. The greatest reward was not the money itself, but the kind of man he had to become in order to earn it, keep it, and grow it without losing himself in the process. He had reached the point where money was no longer the main teacher. Principles were. The deeper he went into the journey, the more he realized that wealth without wisdom was a liability, not an asset. He had seen people with impressive fortunes crumble under the weight of poor judgment, vanity, and reckless decisions. It wasn't just about making the right moves in business, it was about cultivating the kind of inner character that would make those moves inevitable. He began to value patience over speed, depth over breadth, substance over appearance. His thinking slowed down in the best way, not sluggish but deliberate, like a master craftsman shaping something that would last for generations. This was the stage where the excitement of early wins gave way to the steady satisfaction of mastery. One of the strongest lessons he had learned by now was that wealth responds to clarity. Ambiguity, he realized, is expensive. If you don't know exactly what you want, exactly what you stand for, and exactly how you intend to serve, you will pay for that uncertainty in wasted time, missed opportunities, and costly detours. He made it a habit to refine his vision regularly. What do I want now? What do I no longer want? How do I measure success today compared to 5 years ago? This constant recalibration kept him from drifting into goals that no longer mattered and ensured that every move served the mission. It also kept his mind uncluttered. No chasing trends, no scattering focus, no investing in ventures that looked shiny but had no connection to his real objectives. By this point, he had also embraced the truth that leadership was inseparable from lasting wealth. In the beginning, he had been only responsible for himself, but as his ventures grew, so did the number of people who looked to him for guidance, stability, and direction. Leadership wasn't about control, it was about influence, setting the example in discipline, resilience, and vision so that others could see the standard without him having to repeat it. He realized that wealth expands in proportion to the quality of the people you can inspire and equip, and that meant his personal growth had to stay ahead of his organization's growth. He could not lead where he had not gone himself. Another profound shift was his relationship with time horizons. Earlier in life, he thought in months, then he began to think in years. Now he thought in decades. He understood that the most valuable plays often take the longest to mature, and that patience was not just about waiting, it was about actively positioning for a payoff that might be far in the future. This meant some of his most important work produced no immediate visible reward, and he was at peace with that. He knew that seeds planted today could feed entire generations tomorrow, and this mindset insulated him from the impatience that destroys so many promising ventures. He also refined his understanding of risk. At first he had avoided it, then he had chased it, now he evaluated it. Risk was no longer something to fear or something to worship. It was something to measure, manage, and use strategically. He stopped asking, "What if this fails?" and started asking, "What's the cost of not doing this?" That question led him to investments, partnerships, and innovations that were bold but not reckless. Each move was calculated to serve both the short-term vitality and the long-term strength of his empire. At this level, he could see that money had become less about personal gain and more about creative power. The power to build, to shape, to influence for good. His ventures were no longer just income sources, they were instruments of change. He funded ideas that deserved to exist, supported causes that aligned with his principles, and mentored the next generation of builders. The irony was that in focusing less on wealth for its own sake and more on what it could accomplish, his wealth grew faster and more securely than ever before. And perhaps the greatest truth he had uncovered was this: wealth will never outrun who you are. You can't earn more than your discipline will protect. You can't invest bigger than your courage will allow. You can't build higher than your vision can see. He understood now that the true measure of success wasn't the size of his accounts, but the strength of the foundation beneath them, his habits, his principles, his relationships, and his clarity of purpose. Those were the things that made the wealth real. Those were the things that made it last. By the time he looked back over the road he had traveled, from the man who tried everything and grasped at every shortcut to the man who built slowly, deliberately, and unshakably, he could see exactly what actually works. It wasn't luck, and it wasn't even just hard work. It was alignment. Alignment between thought and action, between vision and execution, between values and results. And once you have that alignment, you no longer wonder if success will come. You know it's already on its way, and you simply keep walking the path until it arrives.